Chosen one, what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about why certain people can never figure you out and why someone very powerful wanted you destroyed. There was an investigation, not the kind you read about in newspapers, but the kind that happens in shadows, funded by people whose names never appear on official documents, the kind where the investigator receives a file with your photograph and a single instruction: find the weakness, find the leverage, find the way to neutralize this threat before they become unstoppable. But here's what nobody anticipated, least of all the investigator who accepted this assignment, thinking it would be routine work. The deeper they dug into your life, the more they realized they weren't investigating a person. They were encountering a phenomenon that defied every category, every profile, every method they had been trained to use. And what they discovered would force them to make a choice that would determine not just your fate, but the fate of everyone like you who dares to live at full power in a world designed to keep people small. Corporate executives who needed dirt on whistleblowers, politicians who wanted leverage on rivals, wealthy families who needed embarrassing relatives discredited. The formula was always the same: dig deep enough, and everyone has something they want to hide. But your file was different from the beginning. The client and the investigator would later realize they never got the client's real name, had provided unusually detailed instructions. This wasn't about finding financial irregularities or personal scandals. This was about something far more specific and far more dangerous. This individual represents a threat to established systems, the brief had stated. They operate outside normal parameters of influence and control. Find the psychological pressure points. Find the trauma that can be weaponized. Find the way to break them before they inspire others to break free from their conditioning. The investigator had assumed they were dealing with some kind of activist or whistleblower, someone who had stumbled onto information that powerful people wanted suppressed. They prepared for the usual investigation: financial records, relationship patterns, digital footprints, psychological weaknesses that could be exploited. What they didn't prepare for was discovering that you weren't a threat because of what you knew. You were a threat because of what you had become. Tumpading Penzicator's first red flag came within hours of beginning their work. Your digital footprint was almost impossibly clean, not because you were hiding anything, but because you seemed to live with a level of intentionality that left no accidental traces. Every online interaction, every financial transaction, every recorded communication showed someone who operated with surgical precision and complete awareness of their impact. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that this precision seemed to extend backward through your entire life, even to periods when you should have been too young or inexperienced to possess such awareness. The investigator found records of choices you had made that seemed paranoid at the time but proved prophetic later. Relationships you had ended that others thought were solid, only to watch those same people implode in exactly the ways you had quietly anticipated. It was as if you had been operating with information that shouldn't have been available to you, as if you could see patterns that others couldn't perceive, predict outcomes that defied logical analysis. The investigator began to feel the first stirrings of something they hadn't experienced in their professional life: genuine unease. But beneath this surface pattern lay something far more disturbing. The investigator discovered that your past wasn't just a collection of experiences, it was a spell book. Every betrayal you had endured, every heartbreak that should have destroyed you, every moment when trust was shattered beyond repair, these weren't just painful events. They were initiations, rituals that had transformed each wound into a source of supernatural wisdom. Most people carry their history like scar tissue, dead weight that limits their movement and reminds them of their vulnerabilities. But you had performed some kind of alchemy that the investigator couldn't categorize or understand. You had taken each trauma and turned it into a rune in a language only you could read, a coded instruction manual for navigating future challenges with precision that bordered on the prophetic. The investigator found evidence of moments where you had literally consulted your pain like an oracle. Faced with new betrayals, you didn't panic or spiral into victim consciousness. Instead, you accessed the wisdom carved into your soul by previous betrayals, using that hard-earned knowledge to navigate the situation with the skill of someone who had been through this exact curriculum before, just wearing different clothes. This discovery sent chills through the investigator's professional composure. They realized they weren't investigating someone who had overcome trauma, they were investigating someone who had weaponized it. But what would come next would transform that unease into something approaching terror. As the investigation deepened, the investigator discovered something that violated every principle they had been taught about human psychology and behavior. Most people's lives follow predictable patterns. Childhood trauma creates specific adult dysfunctions. Educational background correlates with career choices. Socioeconomic status determines relationship patterns. The investigator had built their career on these reliable correlations. Your life laughed at these rules. The investigator found evidence of trauma that should have created dependency patterns, but instead seemed to have forged supernatural independence. Educational experiences that should have led to conventional career paths, but somehow resulted in skills and knowledge that couldn't be categorized. Relationships that defied every demographic prediction, as if you selected people based on criteria that had nothing to do with typical compatibility markers. But the most unsettling discovery was how you had transformed abandonment itself into sovereignty. The investigator found records of relationships that had ended with you being discarded, moments when people you had trusted simply vanished without explanation or closure. They expected to find evidence of wounds that never healed, attachment patterns that kept you chasing after those who had rejected you. Instead, they discovered something that shattered every psychological framework they understood. Each abandonment had become a graduation ceremony. Every time someone walked away from you, instead of chasing or begging or trying to prove your worth, you had used that rejection as a catalyst to build something even more valuable: complete emotional independence. The investigator traced a pattern that began with devastation and ended with liberation. Being abandoned didn't break your spirit. It broke your illusions about needing external validation to feel whole. You had taken each rejection and used it as raw material to construct an inner kingdom so complete, so self-sustaining, that no one's absence could shake its foundation. Where others might have developed codependency or people-pleasing patterns, you had evolved into someone who doesn't wait to be chosen, because you had learned to choose yourself so completely that external selection became irrelevant. The investigator realized they were looking at someone who had turned exile into empire, someone who had transformed every no into fuel for building a life that operates by entirely different rules. More disturbing still was the discovery that your responses to crisis situations showed a pattern the investigator had never encountered. Where most people react emotionally and then rationalize later, you seem to operate from a place of calm certainty, even in the midst of chaos. Where others make decisions based on fear or desire, your choices appeared to emerge from some deeper intelligence that factored in variables the investigator couldn't even identify. The client had wanted psychological pressure points. The investigator was beginning to realize they might be dealing with someone who had transcended the psychological frameworks that make pressure points possible. But the real shock was still coming. Hold that thought for a moment. I need your attention for something very important. We're revealing everything we know about personal power, healing yourself, and healing others through weekly Zoom call. No filters, no holding back. We have been quietly adding all the occult secrets we've collected over literal years of spiritual practice. The techniques and wisdom that transformed us from controlled pawns into conscious creators are now available to those ready to walk the same path. This is your invitation to join Obsidian Inner Order and support our platform so we can continue growing our megaphone to reach other chosen ones waiting for activation. By joining the Obsidian Inner Order, you're not just gaining access to forbidden knowledge, you're becoming part of a movement that's rewriting reality itself. It's a 360 win for all of us. Link is in the description. 3 weeks into the assignment, the investigator made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their career. While tracing your past relationships, they uncovered a pattern that defied explanation. Every person who had tried to manipulate, control or betray you had eventually faced consequences that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Not revenge, not retaliation, something far more unsettling. It was as if reality itself conspired to balance the scales. Business partners who had cheated you found their own ventures mysteriously failing. Romantic partners who had been unfaithful discovered their new relationships crumbling in ways that mirrored their betrayal of you. Friends who had spread rumors about you found themselves isolated by social dynamics they couldn't understand or control. The investigator spent days trying to find evidence that you had orchestrated these outcomes. They searched for proof of manipulation, for networks of influence, for any indication that you were actively seeking retribution. Instead, they found something that challenged their understanding of how the world works. You seem to live in alignment with natural laws that most people never discover, as if your commitment to authentic relationship created a field of energy that naturally repelled deception and attracted genuine connection, as if your refusal to compromise your integrity created a gravitational force that pulled circumstances into alignment with your highest good. The investigator began to realize they weren't investigating a person who could be controlled through conventional means. They were investigating someone who had learned to work with forces that operate beyond the reach of typical manipulation. Yet what truly shook the investigator to their core was discovering that your empathy, which the client had identified as a potential weakness, was actually forged from confronting your own shadows. While others ran from their capacity for darkness, their anger, their potential for destruction, you had walked directly into those territories and made peace with the monsters living there. The investigator found evidence of this shadow integration everywhere, times when your ability to think like a predator had helped you spot one before they could strike. Instances where your capacity for strategic coldness had protected you from manipulation that warmer hearts might have fallen for. Situations where your willingness to be disliked had saved you from compromising your integrity for social acceptance. You hadn't been chosen for your light, the investigator realized with growing alarm. You had been chosen because you had mastered your darkness. This integration of shadow and light created something the investigator had never encountered, a being who could operate with complete authenticity because there were no parts of themselves they were trying to hide from or deny. You had become dangerous in the most beautiful way possible, dangerous to anyone who tried to manipulate you, control you, or diminish you, but completely safe for anyone genuine enough to approach you with honest intentions. The investigator understood why the client feared you. You represented someone who couldn't be controlled because you had already faced and integrated everything that control systems typically exploit. And that's when they received the second set of instructions. The client had been monitoring the investigation's progress, and they were not pleased with the lack of actionable intelligence. The new directive was explicit. If psychological pressure points couldn't be found, they were to be created. The investigator was provided with resources to manufacture scandals, fabricate evidence, or arrange circumstances that would compromise your reputation or safety. This was when the investigator first understood the true nature of their assignment. They weren't investigating a criminal or a threat to national security. They were targeting someone whose very existence challenged systems of power that depend on keeping people controllable, predictable, and dependent. You represented something that certain forces in the world find absolutely unacceptable, a human being who had achieved genuine freedom. Not the illusion of freedom that comes from wealth or status, but the real freedom that emerges when someone has done the inner work necessary to become unshakable, unmanipulatable, and uncompromisingly authentic. The investigator stared at the new instructions and felt something shift inside them. For the first time in their career, they began to question not just their assignment, but the entire system they had spent their life serving. But they were about to discover that questioning the system was only the beginning. As they prepared to implement the client's escalated demands, the investigator made a discovery that would change everything. Your silence wasn't absence, it was containment. The investigator had initially interpreted your tendency toward minimal communication as a potential vulnerability, a sign of social awkwardness or emotional withdrawal that could be exploited. Instead, they discovered that your silence was a strategic choice, a form of power so sophisticated that most people couldn't even recognize it as such. You understood something that the investigator was only beginning to grasp. Not every battle needs to be fought with words, and not every truth needs to be spoken immediately. Your silence wasn't empty, it was full of truths too heavy for shallow minds to handle, insights that could unravel illusions and shift entire power dynamics if ever released at the wrong moment. The investigator found evidence of conversations where others had tried to provoke you, situations where people attempted to push your buttons or force you into reactive patterns. In every single instance you had remained centered, observant, mysteriously calm, not because you didn't care, but because you were playing a longer game than anyone else in the room. This level of self-control comes from understanding that words carry weight, that energy affects every space you enter, and that true power often manifests as the ability to remain sovereign, regardless of external circumstances. The investigator realized they were dealing with someone who had learned to wield silence like a precision instrument, knowing exactly when to speak and when to hold back, understanding that some truths are nuclear and must be handled with the respect that such power demands. But the most terrifying realization was that your silence made you essentially unreadable to conventional interrogation techniques. The client's strategies depended on provoking emotional reactions, creating pressure that would force mistakes or revelations. How do you pressure someone who has learned to find their center in the eye of any storm? As the investigator continued their work, now torn between professional obligation and growing admiration for their subject, they began to experience something unprecedented. The deeper they dug into your life, the more they found themselves confronting aspects of their own existence they had never examined. Your resilience highlighted their own brittleness. Your wisdom exposed their own superficial understanding of human potential. Your sovereignty made them acutely aware of how much they lived in reaction to others' expectations and approval. Most disturbing of all, your commitment to authenticity illuminated the countless ways they had compromised their own integrity for security and acceptance. The investigation was supposed to be about finding your weaknesses, but you had somehow turned it into a mirror that reflected the investigator's own hidden wounds and unexplored potential. Without saying a word, without even knowing you were being investigated, you had created a situation where examining your life became impossible without simultaneously examining what a truly empowered human existence could look like. The investigator found themselves lying awake at night, wondering what their life might have been if they had possessed your courage to refuse diminishment, your commitment to growth over comfort, your willingness to stand alone rather than compromise their deepest values for acceptance. And that's when they realized they had been transformed from hunter into student, from investigator into apprentice, from someone seeking to destroy you into someone desperate to understand how you had achieved what they now recognized as the rarest thing in the world, complete authentic power. But the most profound discovery was yet to come. As the investigator studied your life patterns more deeply, they uncovered something that defied every law of probability and circumstance. You don't chase destiny. Instead, you had become a gravitational force that pulls destiny toward you. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to dismiss. Opportunities that seemed to materialize from thin air at precisely the moments you needed them most. Connections with exactly the right people at exactly the right times. Resources that became available just when your vision required them. obstacles that dissolved or transformed into stepping stones just as you approached them. The investigator spent weeks trying to find evidence of manipulation, networking, or strategic planning that could explain these patterns. Instead, they discovered something that challenged their understanding of how reality operates. You had learned to align your inner reality so completely with your deepest purpose that external circumstances began organizing themselves around that alignment. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was someone who had learned to embody such clarity about their path and purpose that the universe itself seemed to conspire in their favor. You had become a living magnet for experiences that serve your highest evolution, while simultaneously repelling situations that would diminish or distract you. The investigator realized they were witnessing someone who had learned to work with reality as a collaborative partner rather than an adversary to be conquered. Every choice you made seemed to create ripples that brought exactly what you needed while naturally filtering out what would harm you. This level of alignment made you not just uncontrollable, it made you unstoppable. The final directive arrived on a morning when the investigator had already decided they could not continue. The client had grown impatient with subtle approaches and was now demanding direct action. They provided specific instructions for orchestrating a situation that would discredit you publicly and permanently. The investigator was given a timeline, resources, and contacts who would help arrange the necessary evidence, but by this point, the investigator understood something the client had failed to anticipate. You weren't just another target to be neutralized. You were proof that the systems they served, systems based on control, manipulation, and fear, were not only unnecessary, but actively harmful to human potential. The investigator realized they faced a choice that would define not just their career, but their soul. They could complete the assignment, destroy someone whose only crime was achieving genuine freedom, and continue serving systems that keep humanity trapped in cycles of dependency and fear. Or they could find the courage to refuse, knowing that such refusal would likely end their career and possibly their safety. Standing in their office, holding instructions for your destruction, the investigator understood that you had done something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. You hadn't just achieved personal freedom, you had become a living demonstration that such freedom was possible for anyone willing to do the work you had done. And in a world built on the premise that most people must remain controllable and predictable, that kind of demonstration was the ultimate threat. But the investigator's research had uncovered one final element that completed the picture of why you were considered so dangerous. You weren't protecting secrets, you were the secret. You weren't guarding information, you were the information coded and layered in ways that could only be understood by those who had earned the right to see it. Every part of your existence, every boundary you maintained, every selective choice about who received access to which aspects of your authentic self, it was all intentional. You had learned that some people approach others just to take, so you had adapted. You had become selective, not from fear or trauma, but from wisdom. Your truth wasn't something people could demand from you. It was something they had to unlock through patience, through integrity, through proving themselves worthy of such trust. The investigator realized that they had been trying to decode someone who was structured like a living encryption, a soul that revealed itself only to those who approached with genuine respect and earned understanding. This selectivity extended to every aspect of your life, your energy, your time, your emotional investment. Everything was allocated with the precision of someone who understood that these resources were sacred and finite. You didn't give yourself away freely because you had learned through painful experience that most people don't value what they haven't earned. The investigator understood that this was what made you so threatening to systems of control. You couldn't be manipulated because you couldn't be read by those who hadn't done the inner work to understand themselves. You were essentially immune to the psychological leverage that keeps most people manageable because you operated from a level of self-knowledge and self-possession that made external pressure irrelevant. But the investigator's moment of choice revealed something even more profound about the forces they were dealing with. As they struggled with their decision, they began to understand that your power operated on levels they had never suspected. You hadn't just survived your trials and emerged stronger. You had learned to work with natural laws that most people never discover. The investigator realized that every attempt to harm you would likely backfire, not because you would retaliate, but because you had aligned yourself so completely with authentic power that reality itself seemed to protect you. The people who tried to betray you found themselves facing consequences, not because you sought revenge, but because deception naturally creates instability that eventually collapses under its own weight. You had become dangerous not because you could fight your enemies, but because you had transcended the need to fight. You operated from a level of consciousness that made conventional attacks irrelevant. Attempts to diminish you only highlighted your unshakability. Efforts to control you only demonstrated your sovereignty. Strategies to isolate you only revealed how complete you had become within yourself. The investigator understood that they had been hired to destroy someone who couldn't be destroyed through conventional means, because you had already survived everything that could have broken you and used those experiences to forge something unbreakable. The investigator's final report was never filed. Instead, they disappeared from their profession entirely, leaving behind a career built on serving systems they now understood to be fundamentally corrupt. Some say they tried to warn you about the forces targeting you. Others believe they chose to protect your identity and location through their silence. But here's what matters. Chosen one, the investigation failed, not because the investigator lacked skill, but because you represent something that cannot be contained, controlled, or destroyed through external manipulation. You have achieved what every authentic spiritual tradition points toward, but few people attain: complete alignment between your inner truth and your outer expression. The forces that wanted you neutralized failed to understand that people like you aren't threats because of what you do. You're threats because of what you represent. You're living proof that human beings don't have to accept limitation, don't have to compromise their authenticity for security, don't have to remain small to avoid threatening others. Every choice you make to honor your authentic power, every boundary you set to protect your energy, every time you refuse to diminish yourself for others' comfort, you're casting a vote for a different kind of world. A world where people remember their own power, their own worth, their own capacity for creating lives that serve their highest purpose rather than their deepest fears. The investigator learned something that the client who hired them will never understand. Some people cannot be broken because they have already been broken and chose to rebuild themselves according to their own design. Some people cannot be controlled because they have learned to source their worth internally rather than seeking it from external validation. Some people cannot be diminished because they have discovered that their true power comes not from what others think of them, but from what they know to be true about themselves. And that, chosen one, is why no investigation will ever truly capture you, why no system will ever fully control you, and why your very existence continues to inspire others to question the limitations they have accepted in their own lives. You are not just living your purpose, you are proving that purpose-driven life is possible, even in a world designed to keep people distracted, dependent, and disconnected from their authentic power. The investigator's transformation from hunter to protector reveals the most powerful truth of all. Encountering someone who has achieved genuine freedom is so rare and so inspiring that it can awaken even those who have spent their careers serving systems of control and manipulation. You are not hiding from the forces that would diminish you. You are walking openly in your power, knowing that authentic strength creates its own protection, that genuine wisdom generates its own guidance, and that true sovereignty attracts exactly the experiences and relationships that serve your highest evolution, while naturally repelling everything that would compromise your integrity. The investigation that was meant to destroy you instead revealed that you are the investigation, the question that forces others to examine their own relationship with power, authenticity, and the courage required to live without compromise. You are not the answer to anyone else's problems, but you are the example that shows others what becomes possible when someone chooses growth over comfort, consistently enough that transformation becomes inevitable. And in a world hungry for examples of what genuine human potential looks like, that makes you both more valuable and more dangerous than any investigator could have anticipated. The forces that tried to neutralize you failed to understand that people like you cannot be stopped. You can only be multiplied, as your example awakens others to remember their own forgotten power and begin their own journey toward authentic freedom. The investigator learned what you have always known. Some powers are too authentic to be contained, too genuine to be controlled, and too necessary to be destroyed. You are one of those powers, chosen one. And every day you continue to exist in your truth. You make the world safer for others to discover their own.